Dear Joan Tronto, it is an honor and a pleasure to welcome at the Société Philosophique de Louvain one of the member of our university. Since in 2021 you have received the title of Doctor Honoris Causa from the humanities sector. During this very intense week we organized les États généraux du Caire in Brussels, as well as a study day in Louvain-la-Neuve entitled Beyond Pandemics, New Perspective for Care, which has now been published in the Revue Philosophique de Louvain. In it, you contributed with an article entitled Can Democratic Caring Save Our Planet? In February 2023, you were back here to develop a question tackled 2 years before in a symposium organized by the Laboratoire d'anthropologie prospective. Par-dessus les épaules des stagiaires. Most of us are already familiar with your work and its relevance in many fields: nursing, education, feminist studies, architecture, labor sciences, etc. But for those who are just discovering it, and especially for students, I would like to reiterate a few stages. Avec Carol Gilligan, Joan Tronto est en effet la grande figure des théories du Caire, qui ont pour ambition de penser une éthique féministe en se détachant des théories de la justice prétendument neutres. Le Caire, si difficile à traduire en français que nous y avons renoncé, devrait être au cœur de nos vies. Pourtant, dans nos sociétés, il est la face cachée et reléguée de nos existences qui prétendent à une autonomie bien abstraite. Il était d'abord délégué aux femmes, qui doivent encore très souvent se charger de la majorité des tâches de soins aux vulnérables, aux enfants, aux personnes âgées et aux malades, tant à la maison que dans les institutions. Et lorsque les femmes parviennent à s'en libérer, c'est pour en faire peser la charge sur des personnes vulnérables socialement et économiquement, d'abord à l'échelle d'un pays et ensuite à l'échelle internationale. Réaliser que prendre soin n'est pas un signe de faiblesse, mais une nécessité à chaque instant de toute vie, c'est tenter de briser ce cercle vicieux de la vulnérabilisation et de la marginalisation. En 1993 paraît Moral Boundaries, traduit en français en 2009 sous le titre « Un monde vulnérable » pour une éthique politique du Caire. Cet ouvrage, désormais classique, entend sortir le Caire de la seule sphère de l'éthique pour lui faire franchir 3 frontières. D'abord, il passe de la question de l'éthique à la question politique, ensuite de la question du comment agir à la question de la justice, enfin de celle du privé à la dimension publique. Avec Bérénice Fischer, Joan Tronto définit le Caire comme, je cite, « une activité générique qui comprend tout ce que nous faisons pour maintenir, perpétuer, réparer notre monde, de sorte que nous puissions y vivre aussi bien que possible. Ce monde qui comprend nos corps, nous-mêmes et notre environnement. Tous les éléments que nous cherchons à relier en un réseau complexe en soutien à la vie. » Fin de citation. Dans un premier temps, Joan Tronto a identifié 4 phases du Caire. Premièrement, se soucier de, caring about. Deuxièmement, se sentir responsable, taking care of. Troisièmement, prendre soin activement, caregiving. Et quatrièmement, vérifier la justesse du soin apporté, care receiving. Dans l'ouvrage suivant, Caring Democracy, Market, Equality and Justice, en 2013, une 5e phase a été ajoutée, Caring with, c'est-à-dire la phase proprement politique dans laquelle le Caire devient l'affaire de tous. En effet, une situation asymétrique entre pourvoyeurs et receveurs de soins risquait de se traduire en une relation de pouvoir et de domination. Pour déjouer ce piège, il faut que la responsabilité du Caire ne soit pas l'affaire de quelques-uns, mais que sa répartition juste soit l'objet central de nos démocraties. Je laisse de côté les nombreux articles publiés, mais je voulais citer encore en 2015 le livre « Who Cares? How to Reshape a Democratic Politics » qui approfondissait encore cette question. Aujourd'hui, nous allons voir à quel point cette préoccupation engendre un tournant radical pour nos démocraties qui continue largement à se laisser guider par des questions économiques plus que par la vie qu'elle devrait protéger et faire s'épanouir. Dear Joan Tronto, we are delighted to welcome you back in our university and to continue this dialogue with you which engages a completely different vision of the world. We would like to thank you for your generosity and for the strong proposals you have put forward for keep alive the hope of a caring world. And now I give you the floor for the lecture, The Revolutionary Potential of Caring Democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathalie, for this beautiful introduction. Good evening, everyone. And please forgive me that still I cannot speak in French. So, oh my God, okay. In my talk this evening, I want to assess the progress and potential for care and democracy in our current world situation. Yes? Oh, let's see what we can do. Oh, yeah, let me just hold it. It doesn't work at all. No, it does. How about that? Yeah, okay.
You can move this one if you want.
Yeah, that one doesn't
No?
amplify. That one's just for the camera. This one's for the audience. Okay. So, this is better? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to assess the potential for care and democracy in the world. I think it is fair to say the picture is mixed. On peut parler comme ci, comme ça? We have made a great progress in the decades since Caring Democracy was published, but there has also arisen a punishing backlash against caring, against feminism, and against the democratic pluralism that care and feminism would usher into this world. After the assessment, I want to try to be more optimistic and to suggest some of the ways that we can act to further the cause of caring democracy. So I will begin with some reflections on where we are, talk about some critical questions and dilemma, and then offer you some thoughts for more fundamental changes. We start where we are. Caring democracy requires that we redefine democracy itself. I argued in the book, democratic politics should center upon assigning responsibilities for care and for ensuring that democratic citizens are as capable as possible of participating in this assignment of responsibilities. So 2 things. 1, change the subject of politics away from it's the economy stupid to care. 2nd, make sure that everybody who's going to be engaged in care can participate in deciding how those decisions should be made. Now, such a change would require a procedural commitment to eliminate privilege and strengthen equality, and also a substantive commitment that caring well become the central task of political life. Now, people almost react to this idea by saying, oh, that's so utopian. That will never, ever happen. But in the last decade, we've made a lot of progress. And because we've made progress, I think it's wrong to say it's utopian. It's hard. It's not utopian. So let's begin with the progress we made. First, please work, please work. You are going to be so impressed with this slide. I got to tell you, it took me an hour to do it. 2 hours, really. Although the COVID pandemic was a public health disaster, global economic activity suffered significantly as a result of government activities to control the health crisis. So public health mattered more, care mattered more than the economy. While the harms of the pandemic continued to fall more heavily on those who are most vulnerable within each society, and they followed deeply entrenched patterns of colonization globally, And while those lessons seem already forgotten, there was a brief moment in which public health seemed to matter more than wealth. Although, of course, billionaires continue to make more billions during the pandemic, but we'll leave that for another day. Yet there's some evidence that in the welfare states in Europe, there was more concern to provide benefits to those who were most likely to be affected by the pandemic. In other words, care really did matter. And in at least one place where it's been studied closely, Ireland, the response provoked greater public trust than had similar mitigation during the Great Recession. So care was on the international political agenda, and essential care workers, for at least a moment, were brought out of their normally invisible locations. On October 29th, 2023, the United Nations proclaimed for the first day an International Day of Care and Support. This may not be much. After all, today is March 11. In the United States, we celebrate National Oatmeal Nut Waffle Day. And International Women's Day is much bigger, but it's still kind of not making much change, is it? So these resolutions are something, but they aren't maybe much. More importantly, the United Nations Human Rights Council called upon the High Commissioner for Human Rights to convene an expert workshop of the High Commissioner to prepare, quote, a comprehensive thematic study on the human rights dimension of care and support, unquote. In English, the UN is starting to think of care as a human right. There's the resolution of it. The Domestic Workers Union, the International Labor's Organization passed a resolution in 2011 already to organize domestic workers, and almost every country in the world, except the United States, has signed on to this international order. In Latin America, many care policies have been adopted, and the UN continues to encourage nations to adopt national care policies. In Mexico, the first division of the Supreme Court has recently declared care to be a human right. So these are global signs of taking care seriously. Now, some recent manifestos have been issued by Oxfam, by UN Women, by a group of Austrian scholars for care, by a women's budgetary group in the United Kingdom, by CPAL in the South, by the Purple Pact, by a group called the United Justice and Rights Action Collective, which is a group of women from Latin America, Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, by Italian feminists, by the Global Women's Strike for Peace, by Public Services International, and in a book published called The Care Manifesto by the Care Collective. This is a lot of stuff. And almost all of these manifestos focus on the same kinds of issues. We need to find new revenues to support people doing care, and we need to make it possible for people to live. Even corporations are beginning to talk about care in a way that may actually have some meaning. There's a group called the Mouvement Impact in France, which is a group of companies committed to making a more sustainable way of living. So everywhere in the world, we can see that care is actually everywhere. I've been thinking about care for over 30 years, but frankly, I never imagined that these ideas would actually have such an impact in the world. And yet, we should not be so optimistic. There is, at the same time that women are talking about care, there's also this angry backlash coming. The prevailing message of this backlash emphasizes that the world is a dangerous place, that we should be afraid and suspicious of others who threaten us fundamentally. The folly of trying to care more in such a world does not even need to be articulated. It just follows from reality. If this is the reality, then care must be utopia. Oh my goodness. Hello? Should I kick this wire again? Oh, I threatened it, okay. There, backlash. So, the intensified neoliberal wealth care policies of the welfare state have been well documented in, oh my God, don't touch the computer again. Stop it. Please come back. Okay, it comes back, but it decides where to go. I don't understand, never mind. In a book called The Care Crisis, published in 2022, Dowling writes about what she calls the care fix in the UK. Whenever a crisis arises and the public suddenly sees that there's no care in a particular area, money flows there for a very short time. Elected officials care what people like me think. The global average was 64% of people disagreeing with this statement. People aren't wrong to think there's something wrong with democracy. Most people think that states do not support them. Do elected officials care about ordinary citizens? The answer is, we don't think so. In the United States, only 27% of people agreed with that claim. And people aren't wrong, because when studies were done, oh my God, when studies were done about the policies and compared public opinion in the United States with what actually governments enacted, guess what? The policies enacted were much more likely to support the policy preferences of elites and businesses than they were to support the policy preferences of everyday citizens. It shouldn't surprise us, but it does tell us that democracy is not in touch with what most people want. Okay. Oh, I see what I'm doing wrong. I'm kind of waving my hands around here, and it's making the slides go forward. Sorry. So people are tuning out the political agenda. Right-wing forces hostile to a more caring world realize that they can mobilize these negative emotions and harsh judgments to make other citizens more distrustful and passive. The more citizens are distrustful and passive, the more power a minority, like right-wing authoritarian parties, are able to exert influence, right? So you make most people think, oh, politics, it's all dirty business, and then you take over. That's how it works. That's how the backlash works. The end result is a vicious circle of disengagement and then disappointment. And as citizens become less willing to hold political leaders to account, there become fewer ways for citizens to hold political leaders on account. It's not the circumstance under which you're going to make much positive change. Right? Is that clear? So, the question then becomes, how does revolutionary caring democracy happen? The revolutionary potential of care cannot be counted up, I think, as wins and losses public opinion polls. We have to go back to the fundamental point that the definition of care, which Professor Frogneux read to you, is very broad. This is going to be a very long process. The change isn't going to happen all at once. It requires that we think differently, not only about care, but also philosophically. My dear friend Margaret Urban Walker distinguishes between what she calls theoretico-juridical thought. Do I have a slide on this? Forgive me because I didn't bring with me the copy of the paper that actually has all these things marked on it. Now, Walker distinguishes between what she calls a theoretical, juridical way of looking at the world, where we have principles and then derive from them, versus what she calls an expressive, collaborative morality. That is, we are all already in a world where we try to have some understanding collectively of what moral life is. And so we must constantly reevaluate with one another what our moral standards are and where we are thinking. It is then a relational form of thinking, and it is a very different way of doing philosophy. It's a very different way of thinking about the world. I wish I could tell you I understood this idea. I don't. It's sometimes your ideas are smarter than you are, And in truth, relationality is a way we're going to transform. That's really at the heart of what this revolution is about. We'll come back to that towards the end. Now, while care is universal, it's also the case that not all forms of care are good. There are a lot of really bad forms of care. Slavery was a system of care. Not one that any of us, I hope, would endorse, but it's a system of care. And so the question is, how do we begin to distinguish between types of care and make sure that the care that we're talking about is of the right sort? So there are dilemmas and difficulties in moving forward, and one of those dangers especially is the danger of containment. I made this point already back in 1993 in writing Moral Boundaries, that when you don't like an idea, one way to deal with it is to admit, okay, powerful idea, good, but it only applies in this very small example, or this very small realm of life. The claim of care is a claim that is much more universal and much broader. So how are we going to get to a place where we can do this? Well, first we have to avoid the dangers of being caught and contained by recognizing that they're going to come. Some colleagues at Cork University in Ireland issued a report recently called Care Visions. And what they wrote about was the discourse of COVID in Ireland. Remember, I told you, Ireland did better than most countries. People were more trusting after their interventions about COVID than they had been in 2008. People thought that the government had done a basically good job. But with colleagues who were interested in care ethics looked closely at the discourse on care that had been produced by the Irish state, what they discovered was that it was a language, again, that was very much tied to an old way of thinking, that care was a thing which you distributed to people, and once you distributed it to people, then you were done, you had finished it. That's not exactly what we've been trying to talk about. And so I've decided that we need to think more closely about what are going to be the catching points, where people are going to get stuck as we try to think about care in a more positive way. Here's some examples. Joan, why did you put so many words on one slide? That was very bad of you. Do not do that again. Sorry. The first one. This is a really powerful one. Does turning care into work and economizing it make it better or worse? This is a really hard case for me to think about. In general, most feminist analyses of the last 50 years have said women will do better when women become more attached to the labor market. And there's truth to that, right? When women have their own jobs, their own money, they are more free from other people in their family, etc. But it comes at a cost, which is that the care work then has to be done by someone else or done as a double shift. But turning care into just work is not necessarily a good solution. For example, in the United States, there's a really wonderful organization called the Domestic Workers United. And they use this phrase to describe what they do. Our work is essential, and we put ourselves at risk to continue to care. We do the work that makes all other work possible. I know, isn't that like saying what we do isn't really that important, but it lets other really important things get done? You can see why they say this, because they want higher wages, they want higher status, they want more support. But you can also see that at the same time they're saying this, they're also undermining their own claim that care is important, right? Nancy Fraser, in her book on cannibal capitalism, wrote about the fact that care is so essential and nature is so essential that now we will finally realize, Nancy's a dear socialist, committed to the cause to the end, now we will realize, because we see that what's happening to care, that it's necessary to have a socialist revolution. I'm sorry, I think she's wrong. I think she's wrong because capitalism will find a way to turn care into another source of wealth. And that's already happening. It's already happening as Pramila Nidison argues in a book called Care, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Some of you know what that's a joke about? No? Well, Lenin had written a book called Imperialism, the Highest Form of Capitalism. So this is kind of a riff on that title. She says, look, what's going to happen with care is that it's going to get more and more marketized, and people are going to figure out a way to collect more and more money from the care workers, from the people who need care, from the people who make things that are useful in care, and it's going to become a better and bigger industry. So, economizing care doesn't necessarily help. How about changing the response to the authoritarian turn? What can we do about this? Authoritarians, though, argue, and this is the power of their message, that they're helping people. They don't say, we're criticizing people. They don't say we're cruel and mean. They say, we are helping the real good people support their families better. And if you buy that message, then it's going to be difficult to break away from it. They determine who deserves to be protected, and then they create enemies to protect us from. For example, all this discussion about sexuality and about transgender people and how dangerous they are, that is meant to make you commit yourself to their ideals, because it's a way to solidify the fact that the world's a dangerous place, that there are others out there who are really, really, really dangerous, and you need protection from them. What to do about our current failures of political leadership? Well, what's interesting is that anger has the power to weaken individuals' commitment to democratic values. This is what the political psychologists tell us. When you make people angry, they've done experiments, and what they've discovered is that when you make people angry, they become less democratic. Isn't that fascinating? And guess what our current failed leaderships spend their time doing? Making us furious, calling people's names, laughing at them, being cruel. And all of this makes people less committed to democratic values and decency. Finally, there's the fact that among the powerful economic interests in the world, democracy is not a popular idea. Usually they can manipulate voting majorities, but it would be much simpler if they didn't have to. And so the more they can get people to stop taking interest in politics and leave it to them to just get what they want, the more successful they will be. This is the main point of Nancy MacLean's book, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. And although it's about the US, it's a really interesting book about the blueprint for how making people dissociate from democracy leaves it in the hands of the wealthy and makes their lives easier. Finally, there's a really bad point that we have to think about in these catching points, and that is about privilege and equality. To lose a privilege is to lose status. For people who are in positions of privilege or presumed privilege, to be made equal is a come down for those whose privilege has let them ignore the existence of domination. After all, as many have observed, when past privileges are called into question, the status of people who have held those privileges changes when their privilege is undone. They are demoted, and so equality itself feels like a threat. Okay, in the light of all these problems, how is it going to be possible to move forward? Well, let's talk about some more fundamental change. To create change, you require something actually kind of simple. It isn't that people's lives are disorganized, Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward argued, because people's lives are always disorganized. People blame themselves for their lives being disorganized. How many of you have problems thinking about how to meet all your caring obligations to your parents, to your kids, to your colleagues? It's really hard. But when people realize that the disorder appears to be caused by someone else, someone specifically else, then you begin to act. When you see it's the landlords who are raising the rents without any justification, then you begin to complain that your rent is too high. And so you need to find the source of the problem and point to the particular people who are doing it, and then you can make change. In a recent book called Reckoning, Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements, Diva Woodley argues that democracy needs social movements, and it needs people to be committed to social movements. So what are the kinds of revolutionary issues that CARE raises? And this is the hopeful part, because this is our checklist for what we have to do next. Ready? First, we have to think about vulnerability. We have to think about the fact that all humans all the time are vulnerable, although some humans are more vulnerable than others. And we have to find a way to get people to be willing to give up their anger, recognize their vulnerability, and think about sharing their vulnerability with others. It's not easy, right? Second, we have to think about time more. Time is the hidden, although it's actually large, piece of care that we miss. Caring takes time. Developing relationships takes time. Being in relationships requires not only time, but unpredicted amounts of time. What's interesting is that unpredictable amounts of time now have worked to the detriment of workers, right? We need flexible hours because otherwise we're paying workers too much to just stand around. Why have 4 nurses on the floor? Tonight we only need 3. Tomorrow we might need 4, but if we only hire 3, they'll figure it out. And then those 3 nurses, one of them will quit because the work is too hard, right? So the flexibility of time is now all on the side of the people who want to make more wealth. What we need to do is recapture and allow for ourselves time. Time to care for ourselves, time to be there and present when people need our care. We need time, perhaps most importantly, to reflect and think about what we're doing. And finally, we need time to think and engage as citizens with each other. Thirdly, we need to be sure to keep thinking constantly when we think of care about the kinds of privileges that are always at work. Privileges of gender, privileges of race, of class, of ableism, of heterosexuality, is that better? Of the gender binary. All of those things are constantly at challenge when we're talking about care, and if we forget them for a moment, we're going to lose some of the care that needs to be going along. It's a lot, right? It's a big list, but we have to keep these things constantly in mind. Fourth, people need to be active and not passive. Care is an activity, and like any activity, we get better at it the more we do it. If you don't do it at all, you don't know how. And that's as true of sinking a basketball into a hoop as it is of recognizing what kind of need the people around you have. The more you do it, the more you get good at it. And being a citizen requires us to be active rather than passive. And making change requires us to be active rather than passive. The revolution will not happen if you watch TikTok. Fifth, we need to be aware of the fact that we need to address political institutions, educational institutions, cultural institutions, and support strong institutions in society. Are you tired yet? Because we're only halfway through the list. Sixth, we need to think about the relationships of humans to other species on the planet, because Although we like to think sometimes that we are the dominant species, we are the species that is wrecking this planet, and we need to be in relation to the other animals, plants, which can teach us a lot. Indigenous forms of knowledge often stress that humans come on the world pretty late, actually, compared to the animals and compared to even the rocks and rivers that were there first. They are our teachers. We need to listen to them. Seventh, and obviously, we need to think about the Anthropocene. We need to think about what it is that we're doing that is creating havoc for the environment, and that the solution to this is not going to be more technology, better ways of getting solar energy or focusing singly on if we only put parachutes over the globe, we'll be able to stop global warming. No, we really need to think about how are we going to make this change. 8, we need to always be aware of the power imbalances that operate everywhere in our lives, from the power imbalances in care relations, which are real, to the power imbalances in making decisions about who's going to do caring work, in making sure that everybody's voice is heard. That's not easy. People who have been excluded think, why should I bother telling these people again what the problems are for me? But if you don't listen, if you're not able to listen to those voices, you'll never be able to make change. So once again, there's a vicious circle that operates that we have to somehow fix. 9th, the relational revolution undoes even our notions of science. The scientific revolution that begins in the late 15th, early 16th century is a revolution that moves us away from what Carolyn Merchant called lively nature to what she called the death of nature. If you think of the natural world as a bunch of dead things that we are able to manipulate, you will have a very different relationship to it than if you think of it as lively and somehow as alive as we ourselves are. It's a very complicated idea, but it's at the base, I think, ultimately, of what relationality is about. That we see the relations between things as the real things, and the things themselves as merely accidental to the relationships, or as transformed by the relationships. Again, we could spend like a month on each of these ideas. This one is perhaps the most difficult. Finally, 10th, care also has an aesthetic, and we need to think about the relationship of beauty to care. Caring well is a beautiful thing. If you've seen someone care for someone closely, you can see the beauty in it. It's also the case that artists engaged in their production of artistic works care deeply about them and produce beauty as a way of demonstrating their care. What would happen if we moved care, which we usually think of as dirty, basic, boring, repetitious, into and in connection with the realm of the aesthetic, the beautiful, the higher, and to do so would again disrupt the way we think about the world. My friends, the stakes are high. Here's a passage from Daniel Allen, which was published actually at the same time as that article about deconsolidation of democracy. This was after the Trump victory and those guys were marching in Virginia saying, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us." She wrote, "The simple fact of the matter is that the world has never built a multi-ethnic democracy in which no particular ethnic group is in the majority, and where political equality, social equality, and economies that empower all have been achieved. The world has never done it." But she continues, "We are engaged in a fight over whether to work together to build such a world." It's no longer like we just haven't got there. It's, is this still our goal? I think care suggests to us that it should be. So how will we respond to this challenge? We need to move towards a culture that accepts vulnerability and responds not with anger and anxiety, but with kindness, compassion, and care. Thank you.